Elon Musk and his DOGE team say they're just following the money, auditing government programs and databases to identify trillions of dollars of waste, fraud, and abuse in government programs. Seasoned government auditors, though, are saying not so fast. Federal News Network's Terry Gerton spoke with Wired magazine reporter Vittoria Elliott about some of what she's heard in discussions with current and former members of federal audit teams.
Vittoria, you spoke to actual government auditors who wouldn't go on the record about what they're seeing. What did you find out?
I think something that's really important to understand is, DOGE has come in and said that what they're doing, going into agencies, cutting their contracts, accessing sensitive payment or IT systems, is that fundamentally what they're doing is a quote unquote an audit. And I think a lot of times when DOGE talks about what they're doing, they make it seem like we don't already have systems to do these things within the federal government. And I think that's sort of a hallmark sometimes of the tech industry generally, so often they're reinventing existing systems, and that's not always bad, but that doesn't mean those systems aren't already there and there isn't stuff to be learned from them. Like we already had cabs before Uber, we already had hotels before Airbnb. And so just because that's the case doesn't again mean that there aren't improvements to be made to industries or systems. But I think similarly, DOGE has come into the federal government and sort of pretended like systems don't exist to do these things where they do. And there are actually entire systems set up to be able to audit the federal government. Every agency has an inspector general that can run an audit that can investigate these things, either based on complaints or congressional investigations that order them to do so. And there are trained people who know how to go through these systems and do forensic audits. And so I spoke to two auditors who have worked on technical and financial audits, meaning that they know how to go through the minutia of an agency or program spending. They know how to go into their systems and they know how these processes should work. And what they told me was, first off, an audit normally takes 6 to 18 months. And that's not auditing an entire agency. Often that's auditing a single program. And that's because, first off, you have to interview a lot of people who are involved in that program to really understand how it works. Then you've got to get into the nitty-gritty of their books, of their systems, to really figure out what's going on. And then you write up a full report where you sort of cite all these things and make actual recommendations about how these things can be fixed. And that gets submitted often for public consumption. You can go on, for instance, to the Health and Human Services website, and you can see from the Inspector General's office there the audits and their recommendations, and sometimes even how much money you might save if you implemented those recommendations. And auditors are often able to then follow up around their recommendations being implemented. On top of that, because these people are coming in from the outside with no government experience, it's very likely, and seems actually entirely the case, that they're misinterpreting what they're finding. That is another problem because it means that they might be giving the public bad information and cutting people, programs, jobs, contracts that are actually really necessary for things to function because they don't understand them.
Well, you're right. It's not like people who work in, or at least who used to work in the government, didn't know where the problems were, or that, as an example, cross-referencing Social Security and IRS databases might help identify some fraudulent claims. But there are huge barriers against doing this. There's technical, sometimes the systems are written in different code, and there's law against it. So how is DOGE, completely absent of their ability to do a real audit, how are they getting around the law to access these databases?
I think we're really seeing a move fast and break things sort of situation here. I think a really great example of this, for instance, is David Labrick, who was at the Bureau of Fiscal Service, which is nested within the Treasury and handles all the payments that go out from Treasury. He was asked to provide DOGE access to the very sensitive payment systems in Treasury. And he was forced to resign because he was not comfortable doing that. So I think in many cases, as we saw with USAID, where people tried to resist giving DOGE access and were fired, the answer, it seems, is that they are given orders to provide access to these systems. And many times people are choosing between their jobs and their livelihood and their comfort with that order. And I think the second thing that, we need to take into account is DOGE was and the Trump administration were really smart. They appropriated an existing entity, the US Digital Service, which is allowed to sort of go into any non-classified IT system for the purpose of modernizing it. It was established under the Obama administration to try and bring the government into the digital future. And by reappropriating that as the US DOGE service, it does actually have an existing pretty wide mandate to go into these places. And then the executive order basically says every agency sort of needs to have a DOGE team or liaison. So they really have set this up to, if not provide a legal foundation, certainly a sense of authority around this.
I'm speaking with Vittoria Elliott, a reporter for Wired magazine. DOGE says it's taking all of the data it's getting and feeding it into AI tools. What's the risk of using these AI tools that haven't been vetted or verified to crosswalk all of this personal data that they're vacuuming up?
Well, we don't necessarily know what they're doing with all of this data right now. We have some indications, obviously. So, for instance, the General Services Administration rolled out GSAI, which is an AI assistant, and people who spoke to my colleague about it basically said that it's not much better than an intern. But I think the biggest thing here, when DOGE talks about efficiency, I think we really need to interrogate what efficiency means. So to like you and me, efficiency might mean I go online, I file my form with the government, everything works fine. It takes 5 minutes. Hooray. I would love if my taxes worked that way. I would be down for more efficient tax system, please. But oftentimes, I think we need to be careful, right? Because efficiency doesn't mean that to everybody. For instance, in the private equity VC space, efficiency means doing more with less. It means smaller teams running with only what you need in order to make the most money. And, when we're talking about private equity, funnel the most money up to shareholders, which is sort of how our business system works. And that's also considered efficient. So I think when we're talking about efficiency here, we really need to ask the question, efficient for who and efficient towards what end and in what way? Because the thing is, all these people who work for the government who are losing their jobs, they're saying my job being eliminated won't make things more efficient. Cutting people who work, for instance, in the call centers for Social Security, that's not going to make that system more efficient for an elderly user who maybe doesn't feel comfortable using an online portal to access their benefits. That makes it deeply inefficient for them. But it is, quote unquote, efficient to have less people that you need to manage, have less people that you need to pay if you're thinking about it from this purely business perspective, which a lot of these people have. And I think AI is part of that. The big push of AI is that it makes things more efficient. It makes these systems more efficient. It means you don't have to have as many people on staff. But efficient for whom? Yeah, that's maybe more efficient for someone who is a manager, someone who is like DOGE, who maybe they don't want to oversee a ton of people at an agency or whatever. But is that efficient for the American taxpayer? Is that efficient for the American citizen who's going to have to interact with that system? I don't want, dealing with sensitive government systems where, my grandmother has to figure out whether or not her Social Security is being dealt with appropriately to be run that way. I don't want to have to figure out if my tax return is done that way. So I really think the use of AI kind of feeds into this greater question of what do we mean when we're talking about efficiency? I don't think people have really even nailed that down when we're talking about DOGE, but I think that's like a first principle sort of understanding of what's happening here.
That's an interesting reframing. And as you said, they're moving fast and breaking things ostensibly in the name of reducing fraud and waste. But doesn't this, in fact, open the door to greater fraud opportunities?
Yeah, I think the government workers that I've spoken to have definitely said that. I think one of the big things, right, is that part of what makes government feel so inefficient for some people is that there are all these checks to make sure that it's not fraudulent. The fact that it takes forever to process something, the fact that you have to provide a million forms of identification, the fact that sometimes things are not digitized, that you have to go to your local DMV or go to your local Social Security office and present present that information in person. That feels really inefficient, but actually the reason that happens is to prevent fraud. Some of the quote unquote inefficiency that people really feel in their day-to-day lives with government services exists to prevent fraud. And in their Fox interview last week, the members of DOGE, including Musk, who were there, were talking about how the government has all these different data sets